Why did America revolt against George III? How did Britain get its national anthem from a French king's hemorrhoids? And why did all the princes dump their mistresses and get married? The Kings and Queens of Britain. Part 7. The Hanoverians hate each other. After 111 years on the throne, the Stuart dynasty had died out. Parliament scoured the royal family trees and passed over 50 closer relations because they were Catholic. They finally landed on George I. George was the 54-year-old Elector of Hanover, a German prince. He didn't speak a word of English and had no interest in learning. His interests were war and women. He brought 2 mistresses to London, and the British called them the Elephant and the Maypole. The people despised them as greedy opportunists. George had a major scandal in his past. His wife, Sophia Dorothea of Celle, tired of her husband's dalliances, had dared to take a lover of her own. George had her lover murdered and buried under the floor of Sophia's dressing room, then had Sophia imprisoned. Their eldest son never forgave his father and hated him bitterly. When father and son, both called George, arrived in Britain, Prince George made himself popular by declaring, "I haven't a drop of blood in my veins that is not English," while King George seemed to disdain his new kingdom and spent as little time there as possible. The Scots, in particular, were very unhappy with their new king. They wanted to bring back James II's son, also James, who had been skipped over because he was Catholic. James was living in France at the court of Louis XIV. Louis was very keen on placing a fellow Catholic on the British throne, and he supported James in the Jacobite rebellion. Louis's mistress, Madame de Maintenon, presented James with a song to be sung at his coronation. She had originally ordered it to be composed as a celebration of Louis' survival of a dangerous and painful hemorrhoid surgery. But God Save the King worked just as well for James.
God save our gracious King, long live our noble King, God save the King.
The song is now the national anthem of the United Kingdom and also goes by God Save the Queen, depending on the monarch at the time. The song turned out to be a bigger hit than the rebellion, and James was forced out of England in defeat. With his throne now secure, George went home again to Hanover, leaving the kingdom in the hands of a new figure, the Prime Minister. The first being Sir Robert Walpole. While in Hanover, George received a letter from his long-imprisoned wife, Sophia. She had just died, and her final act was to curse her husband for his cruelty. Shortly after reading the letter, George suffered a stroke while riding in his carriage and died at 67. George II. It was a Hanover family tradition for fathers and sons to hate each other. George I kept his eldest son from participating in court or political life and even prevented him from seeing his own children. When George Sr. died, his son couldn't believe his luck. When presented with his father's will, he pocketed it and it was never seen again. The Elephant and the Maypole were shut out in the cold. He was crowned at age 47. Like his father, George II had a slew of mistresses and was seen by the people as a randy old fool. As he had hated his father, he also hated his son, Prince Frederick, who set up his own rival court. George cut Frederick's allowance and the two badmouthed each other constantly. Meanwhile, in Scotland, another Jacobite rebellion was brewing, this time in support of James the Pretender's son, Bonnie Prince Charlie. This second effort was more successful. The Scots pushed the English out of Edinburgh and took Manchester, but they were expecting French aid that never came. The rebels were defeated by the king's army at the Battle of Culloden, where thousands of Scots were slaughtered. In the aftermath, Scottish clan culture was wiped out. Clan leaders were executed and tartan and bagpipes were outlawed. George's other enemy, his son, was also out of the picture. Prince Frederick was hit in the stomach by a tennis ball, and the resulting ulcer burst and killed him. By this time, Britain had colonies and trade interests all over the world, and those interests rubbed against those of France. The British also felt that their more democratic government, with a king who was pretty much a figurehead, was superior to the European tyrants who, of course, were hated Catholics. Britain joined up with Protestant Prussia against France and Austria in the 7 Years' War. George, now 76, had basically nothing to do with the war. He died on the toilet. George III. Prince Frederick's son became George III at 22. He married German Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and the pair had a happy marriage and 15 children. With the 7 Years' War now won, George ruled the largest empire that had ever been seen. He had been born in Britain, but was raised by a strong-willed Hanoverian mother, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, who instilled in him the German way of ruling, absolute. He wanted to take back power from Parliament and actually rule, rather than be a figurehead. He personally campaigned and poured money into political candidates who would support his bid for power. He got his way, broke up the political parties, and had a docile prime minister who would do his will. But he didn't bet on the fact that with power comes responsibility, and the people blamed him when things went wrong. When Parliament failed to pass a law to help weavers, they rioted against the king. Nicknamed Farmer George, he had always taken a great interest in agriculture. He thought it would be a grand idea for more land to be owned and farmed by the aristocracy. So he championed the Enclosure Act of 1773, which allowed the wealthy to grab up and fence off most of the country, stealing common land that had been shared and farmed by communities for centuries. This had a drastic effect on the country, concentrating wealth in the hands of the few and impoverishing and starving the rest of the population. Another fine idea was the Stamp Act, a tax imposed on the American colonies. The colonists were outraged. They had their own local governments and taxes and refused to pay tax to a government in which they had no representation. They declared independence from Britain in 1776. George sent his army to squash the revolution, but after 5 years of guerrilla warfare, the ragtag colonist rebels defeated the mighty redcoat British army. Newly independent Americans rejected monarchy entirely by setting up their new government as a republic. Britain had lost both valuable tax and trade income and a place to send its criminals. In need of a new penal colony, they turned their sights to the newly explored continent of Australia. Captain James Cook had recently claimed the eastern half of the continent for Britain. Much closer to home, the French Revolution broke out in 1789, and the British aristocracy watched in horror as their neighbors and relatives lost their heads to the guillotine, including King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. It seemed that everywhere common people were rising up in opposition to monarchy. Would George be the next to lose his head? In the face of all these disasters, the king began to display signs of madness, talking incessantly, foaming at the mouth, and rampaging through the palace. Most likely he suffered from porphyria, a hereditary blood disease which has been seen in other branches of the royal family and has the odd side effect of turning one's urine purple. His eldest son, George, Prince of Wales, was named regent while his father was incapacitated. In the Hanoverian tradition, the father and son hated each other. Serious King George could not relate to his playboy son, who was heavily in debt from years of gambling and partying. Years before, the prince had secretly married a Catholic commoner, Maria Fitzherbert, a union that was illegal without the king's permission and very unpopular with the Protestant English. Londoners rioted for a week. Nearly 300 people were killed and the ringleaders were hanged. The king bribed the prince by offering to pay off his debts if he would leave his commoner wife and take a proper royal one, his cousin Caroline of Brunswick. George and Caroline did their duty and produced one child, Charlotte, who was born exactly 9 months after their wedding night. But the couple hated each other and separated before the child was even born, each consoled by their own lovers. When the prince took over as regent, he was thrilled to finally have something to do, but most of his time was spent bickering with Parliament over what rights he should have. The prince sent his own doctor to treat the king, or rather, torture him. He was bled frequently, force-fed experimental medicines, and refused a fire in his room in the freezing winter. Despite his horrendous treatment, the king recovered his senses and returned to rule, but his power was reduced and his government was deeply unpopular. Republican sentiment from France and America had taken hold in Britain. The government grew increasingly paranoid, and a Republican witch hunt began. Postmasters were employed to spy on the British people. The definition of treason was extended to include speaking and writing against the government, and habeas corpus was suspended so suspected enemies of the crown could be imprisoned indefinitely without trial. With support from the French, Ireland rebelled in 1798. They wanted freedom and their own republic, but were defeated by the English army, and the captured rebels were hanged. In response, Parliament signed the 1800 Act of Union, making Ireland not merely ruled by the King of England, but an official part of the country, renamed the United Kingdom. King George sank into madness and went blind. He never recovered, and Prince George took over as regent for good. With his father out of the way, the overweight dandy Prince George devoted himself fully to indulgence. He ate and drank grotesque quantities, had a slew of matronly mistresses, and spent obscene amounts on clothes and luxurious decor, the prime example of which is his palace at Brighton. With so many of the crowned heads of Europe now in baskets, George was seen as ridiculous and completely out of touch. Napoleon had taken control of France and set up members of his family as puppet dictators in the many other European countries he conquered, including the king's ancestral home of Hanover. Now Napoleon was poised to invade Russia, and Britain stood virtually alone in Europe. Despite George's incompetence, he had a strong military and two ingenious leaders, General Wellington in charge of the army and Admiral Nelson in charge of the navy. Britain won the Napoleonic Wars and put many of the old royal families back in power. After the glory of victory, things began to go very badly wrong on the home front. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution meant that many workers were replaced by machinery. There were thousands of unemployed soldiers, and a bad harvest in 1816 left many starving. It didn't help that parliamentary representation had not changed since the Middle Ages. So many manufacturing cities that had grown large had no representation, while sparsely populated so-called rotten boroughs had enough MPs to always get their way. George prevented parliamentary reform at every turn and didn't lift a finger to help his people. He was hugely unpopular and was the frequent subject of vicious cartoons. The country's hopes for the future were embodied in George's only legitimate child, Charlotte. The beautiful and moderate princess and her handsome husband, Prince Leopold, were the Will and Kate of their day. But all hopes were dashed when Charlotte died in childbirth at the age of 21. The entire country mourned the tragedy. And, after 10 years in the twilight of his mind, George III finally died at 81, ending an incredible and tragic 59-year reign, the longest ever at that point. George IV. After a decade of playing pretend king, George IV was over the moon to finally get his hands on the crown. He planned an over-the-top extravagant and perversely expensive coronation, including robes so long it took 9 nobles to carry them. When his long-separated wife, Caroline of Brunswick, returned from Europe to be crowned as queen, George shut the door of Westminster Abbey in her face. She was devastated and died 3 weeks later. George denied her a state funeral, but the people of London seized her coffin and paraded it through the streets, staging their own funeral. The mob was gunned down by the king's guards. Terrified of being attacked and ashamed of his massive figure, George avoided being seen in public. He suffered from several weight-related maladies, including gout and dropsy. He was also beginning to show signs of the madness that had claimed his father. After yet another massive meal, washed down with copious quantities of alcohol, George died at 67. William IV. With no legitimate offspring, George IV's brother became William IV. Like his brother, he too had an illegal marriage, this time to an actress. In fact, not one of his brothers had any legitimate children. When Princess Charlotte died, all of her uncles rushed to dump their mistresses and make royal marriages in the hopes that their offspring would one day wear the crown. William had been a naval officer and was a strict, austere man and a stickler for etiquette. He liked to hear himself talk and gave long, rambling speeches with very little substance. He insisted that his coronation be done on the cheap, which, after his brother's ruinous spending, made him fairly popular at first. What made him unpopular was his obstinate attitude towards badly needed parliamentary reform. The House of Commons wanted more equal representation and for more people to be allowed to vote. This would take power away from the House of Lords, so they opposed it, and William sided with them. With the country on the brink of revolution, William was forced to back down, and the Reform Act of 1832 got rid of the rotten boroughs and limited the monarch's power in politics. After a 7-year reign, William died at 71. The brother who won the reproduction game was Edward, Duke of Kent, whose 18-year-old daughter, Victoria, would take the throne and reign over a grand age of invention and empire. Check out the next video to find out, how did Victoria make weddings white and Christmas green? Why did Edward VIII give up the crown for the woman he loved? And why is the modern royal family called Windsor?